Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to give a few more seconds just to let people get settled so we can get started. We're really excited to have you all here today with us for the Department of Psychiatry's DICE Grand Rounds. And in case you're not sure what DICE stands for, it's Diversity, Inclusion, Culture, and Equity. And we welcome you all here today. We have a few slides here today just to kind of go through some of our basics. We do have a guest speaker here. I'm actually just going to go through some slides and introduce the person to my left who will introduce Dr. Utsey. So these are your learning objectives, slides that we just have to go through. All right, so I would like to introduce you to Dr. Ronke Lattimore-Tapp, who was the person that introduced us to Dr. Utsey. So I'd like her to do the introduction here. Thank you.
I'm going to move that down because I'm short and soft-spoken, but I am really so excited and happy to have Dr. Utsey be able to come and share this information with us. I had first learned about him through ABPSI, the Association of Black Psychologists, and actually through his prior film, Toward a Black Psychology, which chronicled the history of psychology and which I was excited about. We brought here, had a film screening here. And so this summer when I went to the convention and got to see a screening of his latest film, the Central Lunatic Asylum for the Colored Insane, I was just amazed and kind of blown away at how it really talked about what he's going to talk about today. So I'm not going to give a lot of spoilers, but just its importance in highlighting the impact of racism and how it's racialized in our field, and the importance of for us to be able to recognize that so we can address it and be better helpers and healers and supporters in our community. And so I talked to him afterwards, was like, I need to get you to U of R. I got here, I was sending emails to everybody saying we need to bring him who could do this. And so here he is. And so I'm going to be very short and leave it there so that he can have as much time as possible to share with us. So thank you. Let's give him a warm welcome.
And I just want to remind folks that at the end of our presentation, you'll see a QR code on the screen, and you'll need that for your CEUs. And hello, I didn't say hello to our Zoom participants, but we welcome you all as well. And I will be monitoring the Q&A once we hit that session. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good morning. I'm sorry, good afternoon, everybody. It is delightful to be here. I'm really excited to have a dialogue with you. I want to first issue a few disclaimers. I'm a psychologist by training, and so I'm not here to point a finger at psychiatry or psychology, but to point a finger at myself so we can take a moment of introspection and figure out what we're doing in our chosen professions. I recall as a graduate student in New York City, I'm from New York City, went to Fordham University. We had to read a book in our psychotherapy course called House of Cards, Psychology and Psychotherapy Built on Myth. And that book was transformative for me. It provided an ethical foundation from which I would begin to understand what I was engaged in my graduate training process. And that provided a healthy dose of skepticism by which I would view what I was not only trained to do, but what I was practicing as a clinician or teaching as an academic. And so I want to share with you my thoughts, if we look at it that way. Now, I did change the title of my presentation slightly. From Drapetomania to Protest Psychosis is the same, but now it's racism and the weaponization of psychiatry. And I could easily take out psychiatry and insert psychology. And as a psychologist, that's typically my critique, is critiquing psychology. But when I was preparing for this presentation, I discovered that both psychology and psychiatry have a long history of perpetuating racism in their discipline. So I'll begin this presentation with a very short trailer from my current documentary, which is called Central Lunatic Asylum for Colored Insane. And this is a hospital, an insane asylum, as it was called, that's in Petersburg, Virginia, near where I live. It was opened in the aftermath of slavery in 1867, when newly freed enslaved Black people were now allegedly free to go. And so they needed a place to look after those folks who they thought had mental illness or insanity. And we would discover that this place was abused and that psychiatry was weaponized to admit people against their will and for all kinds of spurious reasons. So I'll show the trailer and then we'll continue with the lecture.
I had heard Petersburg had an asylum, and of course my father told us, said they didn't have any minds. They just did anything. Sometimes they did all kinds of things. They didn't have any minds to tell them, and they were called insane.
They had no medication for mentally ill people. Electric shock was the order of the day. Lobotomies, they did lobotomies at Central State.
Physicians, both Europeans as well as white American physicians and psychiatrists, thought about Western assumptions about the primitive nature of people of African descent.
Their idea was that African Americans had a less developed nature, were intended to be servants to white people. And so their idea was that slavery was the natural state for Africans who needed to be guided and led by Europeans for their own health.
Black insanity was often associated with criminality. It was thought to be especially deviant than insanity among whites. And so that very much shaped how people of African descent were treated, were managed in asylums.
Before the Civil War, African American patients, free and enslaved, were sent to an asylum in Williamsburg. It was called the Eastern Lunatic Asylum. And it wasn't until 1869, when an order came to transfer those patients to a separate facility, that they moved to what was then Howard's Grove. In 1870, the name was changed to Central Lunatic Asylum. Eventually it became Central State.
State probably, when it first opened, had about 125 patients. Then between 1901 to about 1910, numbers increased by 600% over the course of just a couple of years or so.
If you want to have a beautiful picture of something, it got to have a good, clear background. And people fussing, talking back to the patient and making an ugly background. So I said, be quiet. And then I would walk not up into their space, but to this. I said, Mr., what is your name? And then I would proceed. I'll call him Mr. Mr., can I help you?
Okay. So that is a trailer for my current film. And I want to make this one point about the rest of the lecture, that I am challenging psychiatry and psychology to a lesser degree in terms of the inherent embeddedness of racism in the discipline. But I think that's an oversimplified analysis of the problem. Certainly, the root cause has evolved from the time of the early asylums. But I want to make the argument or the case that many of those fundamental assumptions about insanity, and particularly people of African descent, have survived. And I want to interrogate how we practice psychiatry and psychology. Now, a lot of times we don't really know the origin of what we do. In psychology, I was always used to telling my students that it began as the study of the soul. Psyche is the Greek for soul or spirit. In psychology, ology is the study of. In psychiatry, eritrea is the means healing or medical treatment. So it's the same concept, that psychiatry didn't begin as a science. It began as a spiritual endeavor, right? And from that time, psychiatry began as the healing or medical treatment of the soul. There was an effort to kind of move that beyond something that was philosophical and mystical to something that was more scientific. But I want to talk about how in the Christian era, we began to take on notions of race before we really knew what it was. And I want to make the case that Blackness has been criminalized in psychiatry and psychology. I know in my own city, Richmond, in fact, the hospital in which my documentary is based, there was a recent death of a Black man named Ergo Ortenio. He came to the medical center seeking psychiatric care, and the sheriffs and staff suffocated him. And I understand there's a very similar case here in Rochester. And the argument that has been made historically is that insanity in Black people has taken on a different characteristic and is often criminalized. And I want to provide a context, at least a hypothesis as to where that came from. And I don't want to offend anybody who's a Christian, Muslim, or Jewish, but I'm going to borrow from the book of Genesis, the King James Version, most common version. And I want to talk about the curse of Ham. We've all heard about the curse of Ham at some point. It's really the story of Noah and Noah's Ark. And so the verse goes, and I won't read the whole thing, that Noah began as a husband and planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk, and he was uncovered in his tent. We know the story. And Ham, the father of Canaan, that's important. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his nakedness and told his two brothers, Shem and Japheth, his two brothers. Now, Shem and Japheth took a cloth and they covered his father to hide his nakedness. Now, when Noah woke up from his drunkenness, he heard what Ham had done, right? And he said to Ham, cursed be Canaan, not Ham. He didn't curse Ham, he cursed Ham's descendants. We'll get back to that in a minute. Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren. And he said, blessed be the Lord of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. God shall enlarge Japheth, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. This, in my mind, or I am proposing that this is the origin of the criminalization of Blackness. Now, why do I say that? Here is the biblical locations of those peoples. The descendants of Ham is Africa. The descendants of Japheth is Europe, and Shem is Asia. This is how the Bible talks about race, right? They talk about peoples or descendants of, but this is theoretically the explanation of how the world was populated in the various racial groups that came from. So we see that Ham's descendants were cursed, and they were supposed to be slaves to his brethren, Japheth and Shem. Now, we do know that in the antebellum South, slave holders used this biblical tale to justify slavery and to push back against abolitionism, right? No question about that. But the curse of Ham served a few fundamental purposes. We already established that psychiatry and psychology began as a mystical discipline, steeped in religious folklore and beliefs, right? And then we had the curse of Ham that became widespread in the South, especially to justify slavery. But the curse of Ham served several purposes that I think we haven't really yet shed. The criminalization of Blackness and immorality, sexual predator trope born of Blackness, and the origin and justification for racialized slavery and the divine right of white domination. That verse in the King James Version, the story of Ham, provides the foundation for lots of components that still exist, not only in psychology, but psychiatry as well. Now, psychiatry would go on, as psychology did, in its early evolution and trying to find its way in the academic institutions. Along came the scientific evolution, which transformed how people viewed the world and their place in it, right? This is usually the 16th, 18th centuries, which laid the foundations to modern science. Now, psychology and psychiatry, as many people always trying to vie for credibility, tried to figure out how can we establish ourselves as a scientific discipline. And so psychiatry would be no different. And then they became based on empiricism and rational inquiry. They began to include the biological basis of behavior. There was anatomical studies in psychiatry and classification and diagnoses. We had nosologies come about that allowed us to kind of figure out particular diagnostic categories. And then, of course, mechanistic philosophy became part of that as well. Then we will move to Europe in the 1880s. We see the eugenics movement begin to take hold. Sir Francis Galton coined the term eugenics in 1883. He was the founder of this movement. It was also a cousin to Charles Darwin. Now, eugenics actually had nothing to do with Black folks, right? Eugenics was born in Europe, and they were interested in trying to figure out amongst Europeans which stock of Europeans was superior, and that those of inferior stock should not be allowed to procreate. So eugenics had no relationship to Black folks or other people of color in its inception. When it came to the US, it would then evolve into something different. They were interested in heritability of traits, controlled reproduction, public health, improvements of the human race, racial class and superiority, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we already know that this movement would take hold in the United States. It would spread to South Africa and Nazi Germany. Many of these ideas were born in Europe and later the US. Now, here's where the title of my presentation comes into play. Samuel Cartwright was a psychiatrist. As you probably know, that in the early days, psychiatry wasn't really a discipline in terms of formal training, that you were a physician and you would kind of adopt a specialty, and that would be your training. Like Sigmund Freud and the others weren't psychiatrists either by training, but would become psychiatrists by their work. Samuel Cartwright was an antebellum psychiatrist in Louisiana, and he had a specialty in working with Negroes, enslaved populations, right? And so Samuel Cartwright said, whereas psychologically normal Negroes are faithful and happy-go-lucky, the mentally afflicted ones pay no attention to the rights of property, slight their work, and raise disturbances with overseers. And Cartwright coined two diagnostic categories that I think are still with us. Drapetomania was the first diagnostic category that Cartwright developed to describe what he saw as abnormal behavior in enslaved people. And drapetomania was literally the flight from home madness. Running away was seen as a sign of mental illness, of insanity, right? Keep in mind, this concept of resistance as pathology will continue to raise its head even till today. So the idea that drapetomania was a disease of the mind, mental alienation, and the best way to deal with it was whippings. The other one was dysesthesia Ethiopica. Again, Ethiopica is in reference to Black people. Black people were called Ethiopians during the early days of importation. They were Ethiopians before they were the other 5 or 6 terms that we've come to know. And this particular diagnostic category reflected rascality, being a rascal, insensibility of nerves, and herbitude of mind. This is when the folks would slight their work. Perhaps they would sabotage farm equipment, they would poison animals, they would steal chickens or sheep or cows, and just simply shrug their work. Again, these are real documented forms of resistance during enslavement. Again, Cartwright saw these as abnormal because in the worldview of the planters, Black people were faithful and happy-go-lucky. Anything else was a sign of mental illness. And again, the important point here, the take-home point is that our worldview shapes how we see everything. And when we see the world in a particular way, when things are outside of that view, we see them as abnormal. And so many times we arrive at conclusions based on a faulty worldview. Now, who was Samuel Cartwright? If you hadn't heard of him, As a psychiatrist, certainly if you are familiar with the Dred Scott decision, which confirmed that Black people were not citizens of the United States, you'll notice that in the introduction, there's an appendix that was written by Samuel Cartwright. This is how influential Samuel Cartwright was. He wrote in an appendix to the Dred Scott decision of the Supreme Court, the natural history of the prophagous race, which means protruding lower jaw, of mankind. And this is where Cartwright talks about drapetomania and the other disorders he diagnosed in enslaved people, right? So Cartwright was a significant person. He wasn't some lunatic, some fringe element. He was a scholar and a physician of significant of his time. Now, Benjamin Rush, as I'm sure you've probably heard, is the father of American psychiatry, all right? Rush argued that Black skin was a result of a mild form of leprosy, a condition he termed negritude. This is the father of American psychiatry. Rush considered African Americans to be inherently inferior and believed they required the guidance and care of white society to attain a degree of civilization. Rush was an abolitionist who advocated for enslaved people to be relocated to colonies in Africa, send them back to Africa, he advocated. The father of American psychiatry. Carl Jung, we all know who Carl Jung is. He's probably, next to Sigmund Freud, the most influential psychiatrist, psychologist of all time. Carl Jung, interestingly, spent a lot of time in Africa. In fact, his concept of the collective unconscious was really solidified by his constant travels to Africa. He himself admits. Carl Jung said that different strata of mind correspond to the history of the races. And he viewed himself as an expert in Negroes, probably because of his frequent travels to Africa. Carl Jung said the Negro has probably a whole historical layer less of gray matter than the white man. He said the energetic sexual repression caused by Caucasians living together with Negroes pulls the white race down. He presented these ideas at the Second Psychoanalytic Congress in 1910. Era B. Everett's psychiatrist, who published Dementia Praecox in the Colored Race in 1913. He said, all honor to the race that has accomplished the impossible, thanks to his bondage, which in reality has a wonderful aid to the colored man. This is almost, I don't want to say a quote, but this is verbatim the concept that we are hearing in Florida, that slavery was beneficial to Black people, that Black people learned some trades in slavery. That idea is not new. Just as the idea of somehow Black folks having low intelligence. These ideas are old as psychiatry themselves. Everett says the necessity for mental initiative was never his, and his racial characteristics of imitation carried him far on the road. The race has learned no lessons in emotional control. They're emotional. And what they attained during their few generations of slavery left them unstable. For this reason, we find the deterioration in the emotional sphere most often in early and persistent manifestation. This is in the Psychoanalytic Review in 1913. This is not a fringe element of the KKK or skinhead or some Nazi movement. This is a prominent psychiatrist. Now, what happened in the interim is that America began transforming as a consequence of the civil rights movement, suffrage movements, and other kinds of efforts. Psychiatry began to take a kinder and gentler form of expression in their racist notions of human behavior. In 1951, Cardina and Oversee published Mark of Oppression. And they said that the Black personality is viewed as a sum total of oppression experienced in America, that racism has deformed the psyche of Black people. There is not a personality trait of the Negro, the source of which cannot be traced to his difficult living conditions. There are no exceptions to this rule. The final result is a wretched internal life. Black people suffer from low self-esteem. Now, this was seen as a liberal stance on the challenges of the Black community. This was how psychiatry and psychology began to soften their genetic predispositions to pathology to social and cultural notions of pathology, but the outcomes remain the same. And so the question we have to ask ourselves as we go through this history, to what degree has our disciplines kind of internalized these notions and that they still exist in insidious ways that we haven't yet been able to kind of realize? All right, Harry Stack Sullivan. We all know who Harry Stack Sullivan is. All right, Harry Stack Sullivan, another influential psychiatrist, said that heterosexual activity seems to be one of the few unrestricted recreational outlets for Negroes. I judge that there are many definitely promiscuous people, and that this laxity arises from factors of personality development as well as from a promiscuous culture. Again, 1964, the fusion of psychiatry and social science. We see racism in psychology and psychiatry becoming softer, gentler. The focus is not on genetics or any kind of innate inferiority, but culture and social conditions. When we know the Senator Patrick Moynihan wrote the Moynihan Report that also kind of piggyback on these ideas that it's Black culture that results in these differences. Now, what I found interesting was that as we began to evolve from the 50s to the 60s, mirroring what was going on in society, the civil rights movement, the Black power struggle in the 60s and 70s, we saw psychiatry kind of adjust in ways that allowed them to explain what was going on, to pathologize resistance. And so we noticed that in the 20s to the 50s, schizophrenia was viewed as mainly a white disorder. Going back to slavery, the idea during slavery was that Black people were immune from insanity because of their lower ordered functioning. They didn't have the capacity to become stressed, right? And to become psychotic, right? And then the argument after slavery was that freedom would be too much for Black people to bear. And we would see rising rates of insanity. These were the notions of insanity that existed. And in the 20s to the 50s, schizophrenia was seen mainly as a white disorder, for the most part, harmless, right? Then we began to see ethnic trends in diagnosis of schizophrenia that emerged in the 60s, right? It became a violent disorder. At the same time, it became a Black disorder. In the 60s, introduced new ways of defining mental illness combined with cultural anxieties about the rise of the Black power movement. Now, a lot happened in the 60s and 70s. Most of us are familiar with the DSM, right? And we have learned to kind of, that has become our Bible, right? And we know that in medicine, because the DSM is a medical book, that science is what determines how we move in our disciplines, and that science is what we relied on to create these diagnostic categories. Is that fair to say? Okay. Now, we also know that in the 80s, late 70s, early 80s, homosexuality was still listed in the DSM-2, I believe, as a mental disorder. Is that accurate? Is that fair to say? And it would be removed, right? Now, breaking from protocol, let me just talk to the audience for a minute. Somebody tell me the scientific procedure that was used to remove homosexuality from the DSM. Thank you. Yes, they voted. The old scientific, rigorous, empirical vote. Now, it never should have been in the first place. That's not my beef. But we can't have votes and pretend something's scientific, right? But this is not unique. The way things get in and the way things get out is not only unscientific, it's political. As soon as the LGBT community had power to make demands, they demanded, as they should have, that it come out. And everybody said, makes sense to me, I vote yes, right? But here we are making decisions about people's lives on things that are voted in and voted out. It doesn't seem scientific to me at all. But we have been invested for 15, 20 years, some of us, in this discipline and the scientific foundations of it, that we sometimes don't realize how unscientific it is. So there was an article written by Walter Bloomberg and Frank Simon, published in the Archives of General Psychiatry That's a pretty prestigious journal in psychiatry, is it not? It was called the Protest Psychosis. This wasn't something somebody made up. This was something some psychiatrists had coined the term, written in an article in an important journal, which was published on their take on protest psychoses. They said that schizophrenia can appear as a protest psychosis whereby Black men develop hostile and aggressive feelings and delusional anti-whiteness after listening to the words of Malcolm X, joining the Black Muslims, or aligning with groups that preach militant resistance to white society. This is a quote from the article I just showed you. I'm not making this up, right? Now, hopefully today this wouldn't get published in that journal anyway, right? But we don't know. We've gotten more sophisticated in how we camouflage science, or lack thereof. But this protest psychosis, they go on, the particular symptomatology we have observed, for which the term protest psychosis is suggested, is influenced by social pressures, civil rights movement, dips into religious doctrine, the Black Muslim group, is guided and content by African subcultural ideologies, and is colored by denial of Caucasian values and hostility thereto. This protest psychosis among prisoners is virtually a repudiation of white civilization. This seems bizarre to me. It really does. But this is not me making this up. It's published in the Archives of General Psychiatry, right? And people are supposed to take us serious. We have to do better with regard to our science. But this take-home point is that resistance to the power structures can be deemed as deviant and pathological, right? And that's the degree to which Blackness has been criminalized in terms of psychiatry and psychology. And if we go back to Drapetomania, running away was literally a criminal act. It was a criminal act, right? And they medicalized it. Not only is it criminal, it's medicalized. Drapetomania. Now, the early Haldol advertisements in the journal, I can't see it, the annuals of, anyway, it's a psychiatry journal, very important one. I can't see the writing. If I had, but it may be in the next one, I'll show you. But you see how the propaganda around schizophrenia and psychoses in terms of Blackness, taking on blackface. And what does it say? Acts promptly to control aggressive and assaultive behavior, right? First choice for starting therapy, the angry Black guy with the pimped out hairdo, right? This is really classic stereotype stuff. I mean, you can't really do better if you tried to. If you tried, you couldn't do better. Oh, another one, Thorazine. If Haldol was enough, Thorazine, right? We've Africanized mental illness now. So not only is it Black, it's African, right? And this is digging at some very base instinct in people about what it means to be African, right? Because many times we don't realize that Black people are first African people, and much of the anti-Blackness is really anti-Africanness. And so we see, again, psychiatry linking these approaches to schizophrenia to Blackness. Again, basic tool in modern psychiatry, Thorazine. We have fertility dolls from the Akan people in West Africa. Effective control of psychotic symptoms, especially useful in agitated, violent, anxious schizophrenic patients. Controlling anger, violence, aggression is a Black thing, according to psychiatry. Again, basic tools of primitive psychiatry, right? Controlling that agitated, violent, or anxious schizophrenic patients. So we can see the pattern here in psychiatry, and psychology too. I could do the same talk in psychology with different examples, equally as compelling in my mind, at least. Now, so what happened? How long did this go on before somebody said, wait a minute, this is not right. Let's examine what we've done. Now, we know that the APA, for you, the American Psychiatric Association, for me, the American Psychological Association, but you guys were founded in 1844, right? It was really a bunch of insane asylum superintendents who got together, right? So Galt down in Richmond, where I'm at, was one of the leaders of this effort, and they created the American Psychiatric Association. And it was only in the 1960s that they said, hold a minute, we have some concerns about proper conduct or improper conduct amongst practitioners. 120 years before somebody said, wait a minute, this is out of control. But it was 130 years before there were a code of ethics in psychiatry. How could that be? 1973 Code of Ethics in Psychiatry by the American Psychiatric Association was developed. And lo and behold, someone said, what we did wasn't right, let's apologize. So in 2021, they said, let's apologize to these Black, Indigenous, and people of color for our support of structural racism in psychiatry. Let's apologize, and they apologize, right? And so the APA, the oldest National Physician Association in the country, is taking an important step to addressing racism in psychiatry. The APA is beginning the process of making amends to both direct and indirect acts of racism in psychiatry. The APA Board of Trustees apologizes to its members, patients, and their families, and the public for enabling discriminatory and prejudicial actions within the APA and racist practices of psychiatric treatment for Black, Indigenous, and POC. The APA is committed to identifying, understanding, and rectifying our past injustices, as well as developing anti-racist policies that promote equity and mental health for all. How long did that take? How long did that take? Now, let's keep in mind, of course, the same criticism, and I don't know if I have time to show the last video. I do want to show it. I may have to take 2 minutes, 5 minutes from the Q&A. Can I do that? All right. Well, here was the insight that I got. Of course, in APA, I belong to the Association of Black Psychologists, and we were founded in 1968 and have been demanding that the APA take accountability since then. And somebody pointed out, and you'll see it in the movie, that the killing of George Floyd is what sparked these coming to Jesus moments with the APAs. That's what had them say, wait a minute, maybe we should look at ourselves. Despite the 100-odd years of people saying this is wrong, of lawsuits, of protests, of really bizarre musings about psychiatry, schizophrenia, protest psychosis. Finally, someone says, maybe we should apologize, right? Anyway, so my organization said, your apology, this is the APA, my APA, also apologized. A little late, actually, you guys apologized first in January. We apologized in October, right? And so my organization said, wait a minute, your apology is a day late and $1 short. So I want to share this with you, which is our response to the apology. Now I pressed the next slide. Should it come on by itself or do I have to press play? Okay.
Jung was satisfied that his dream as a child of a phallic divinity came from the underground of this collective unconscious, but he knew that one such dream was not enough to prove the validity of so revolutionary a concept. He set out to travel the world for further proof. By 1926, he was in the jungle, in the heart of Africa. Already he'd been among the Negroes and Indians of North America. He'd been to North Africa and gone deeply into the mythological development of India, Tibet, China, and Japan.
It is the character that is doing it. There is a definite inherited complexity. You see, we are born into a pattern. We are a pattern. We are a structure that is pre-established through the genes. It is a biological order of our mental functioning. As for instance, our biological or physiological function follows a pattern.
Western psychology cannot intervene to keep white people from enacting racism on black people. So why would we expect Western psychology to be able to fundamentally change itself in order to serve the needs of African people?
So if we really want to understand APA and how destructive it has been and can be against people of African ancestry, I want to start with a quote from Victor Hugo. Hugo said about a century ago, "If a soul is left in darkness, sins will be committed. The guilty one is not he who commits the sin, but he who causes the darkness." APA knows, and to some extent admitted in its apology, that it contributed to the darkness. Now, within this context, Black people are blamed for the racism they experience and then vilified for resistance to it. And APA and Eurocentric psychology have created theories, constructs, assessment tools, and practices that pathologize and vilify us. And then they avoid any real examination of the pathology of white racism. If we start interrogating Western psychology, even on its own standards and terms, I think that we will begin to see the emperor has no clothes on, particularly as it relates to universalism.
All we have to do is open any textbook on the history of psychology and take a list of the names and go back and read their work. It's not hidden. You can look at Francis Galton's work. You can look at Louis Terman. You can look at Henry Herbert Goddard. You can look at James McKean Cattell. All of these people are folks who have been placed on a pedestal in the history of psychology. But if you read their works, you'll see that there's a common and consistent theme of anti-Blackness and ideas that perpetuate this idea of inferiority of Black people.
What we find is that Western psychology from its inception was designed to verify the essential inferiority of Africans and others who differed from this white supremacist European cultural worldview, Euro-American now, norm and or ideal of what optimal human functioning looked like.
So Europeans want to deal with the materials, want to deal with the objects, want to deal with control, want to deal with mastery, want to deal with what's the biggest and what's the smallest, what's the longest and what's the shortest. That it's all kind of quantitative world that they're about. It's not surprising that when Europeans come in contact with any people who are different from themselves by any criteria, the criteria they're most likely to look at are not the human qualities that are out of sight, like love, graciousness, consideration, compassion, caring, charity. Those are invisible things. And those things don't have reality within the Eurocentric way of seeing the world, within the European worldview.
This Eurocentric mindset is harmful in so many ways to who we are and how we walk in the world as people of African ancestry. First, under the constant weight of daily doses of anti-Blackness across generations, try as we might to protect ourselves from messages that we as Black people are not human, not smart enough, not beautiful, not principled, not disciplined, not moral, not trustworthy, and the list goes on and on. We try to fend that off. We try to stay and live in our own truth. But the reality is, when you're getting that 24/7, 365, generation after generation after generation, it takes a toll. The lie creeps into our psyche
And I call it a squatter in our mind, altering our self-image, our image of each other, our image of other racial groups, and our interactions with each other. And this opens the door for internalized racism.
The APA has been instrumental in perpetuating this destructive hegemonic war against African people, using Western psychology as its primary vehicle. Because the psychology as it is taught, studied, and investigated today emerged at the very same time, the early 1900s, that this European cultural worldview translated into a racialized worldview was becoming the preeminent underlying paradigm of the entire social sciences. But it was this first generation of Western psychologists, eugenicists, who banded together to form and fashion and market the APA as the undisputed authority of all things psychological in the US. It has been that positioning, that power positioning, that the APA continues to use in their marketing as the quintessential arbiter of things psychological in the US till this day.
APA's apology is troubling for me. And it's troubling because I have a hard time trusting it. The apology remains pretty ineffectual, both in how it was created, the process that the APA used to gather input on the apology, and the content that went along with that apology in terms of how they listed out the harms that they committed. And then it's problematic for me because it doesn't provide any clear action plan. I haven't seen anything that has come out of APA that makes me think, okay, this apology has some teeth to it. This apology is about repair. This apology is about ensuring that there's no repetition of the harm that has been committed by APA over generations. So what do I think about the apology? Not a whole lot, because I'm still waiting for the substance.
What APA must do to atone for their racist and destructive actions toward African people is a tough question to answer, because it presumes that there is willingness on APA's side. I don't make that presumption. But if there were willingness, the first thing they need to do is to reformulate and or reframe the technologies and policies of Western psychology, almost in entirety. So again, when I make the reference to throwing out the baby and the bathwater, both of them need to be tossed, right? The APA should begin to make reparations to African people who've been subjected to its systemic abuses. So for example, they could provide economic support to independent African organizations that have teaching, training, research, and advocacy components, to develop technologies and policies that support and advance the lived experiences of African people. They could begin to reframe and support HBCUs, which historically has been the pipeline for Black students into psychology, but they're teaching the same hegemonic morass of information. As a result, then, you're turning out students who don't see agency in our own lived experiences.
Personally, I don't think much of the APA apology. I think that Black psychologists in particular have been quite lucid, concise, clear, and vocal in explaining the ways in which psychology as a discipline has harmed Black people for more than 90 years. The fact that the apology came not in response to this 90 years of vocal protest from Black psychologists, but from 9 minutes of video footage of the murder of George Floyd, says something about the depth and about the nature of this apology.
An apology under no circumstances is capable of undoing what has been done. The death, the destruction, the self-negation, the loss of motivation, and all of the hurt that has gone on transgenerationally as a result of those kind of violations, you know. And I don't believe that you can undo those things. What we really need in order to heal is that we must heal ourselves. We must reclaim our own freedom and reclaim our own ability to define who we are and reclaim our ability to be free, self-respecting, self-defining human beings.
If you were to give me a glass of lemonade made with muddy water, I'm not gonna add sugar to it and expect to have a different outcome or a different taste. I'm gonna have to put that glass down. I'm gonna have to go find some clean water, and I'm gonna have to create a new pitcher of lemonade if I want to enjoy lemonade. So I think that's where we are in this historical time frame. We keep thinking about and talking about how we can rehabilitate Western psychology, but Western psychology throughout history has shown us that it does not acknowledge a need for rehabilitation, nor is it motivated to rehabilitate itself. And so we need a completely new system. And if we want to create something that's going to meet the needs and the spiritual and psychological and physical health needs of African people, then it's got to be something that's going to have to be derived from African culture.
All right, that concludes my presentation. I want us to take some time to have a dialogue, discussion, answer questions. This is some recommendations that we can kind of gander at while we talk. But thank you for indulging me. And now I'd love to hear any questions or comments you might have. Thank you. Yes.
I can wait. Dramatic pause.
I can hear you.
First off, thanks so much for the interesting presentation and for making it in person. In the days of endless Zoom meetings, it's a great relief to be able to be here with everybody. So I think there's probably wide agreement in the room that nobody's completely satisfied with the DSM, and I think the fact that things that we now think are not at all pathological, like sexual orientation, making it out of the DSM is a good thing. And I'm wondering if you have a forecast for what kind of disorders you would want to see added or taken away in the DSM-6.
It's a very good question. I was objecting to, well, first I understand the purpose of having a common language among clinicians to kind of describe disorders. I understand that. But my problem is the political nature of this text. The example I give you is not the DSM, but for Black folks, for example, there are behaviors that would make you seem strange or have some symptoms of mental illness that wouldn't be in the DSM, right? So for example, if I showed up today with my hair dyed blonde and blue contact lenses in, the Black folks in the audience would think I was strange, right? But there'd be nothing in the DSM that would allow me to get treatment or help, because there are some behaviors that are culturally derived and specific to cultural context that don't find themselves in the DSM, but do reflect something is amiss. So I think the DSM is limited. And so the best we could do, and I've learned this, I teach a class in my doctoral program called Cultural Awareness. And I tell them at the beginning of the course, I'm not trying to change attitudes. It's too much work, and it's probably impossible. I simply want to raise awareness. So I'm hoping that if we begin to have increased awareness around the limitations of the DSM, we'll do more service, better service to our clients. It's really about awareness of limitations. Yes.
Thank you so much for your presentation and for really walking us through not just sort of the historical injustices, but what that looks like in a present day context, which is a lot of what we grapple with. So in framing my question, I am really struck by some of the commentary in the last few moments of video around the context of the apology, sort of the depth, what that means. And I think a lot of institutions, right, are wrestling with what it means to re-envision what anti-racism looks like in our current context. And that there are often sort of references to past injustices that seem disconnected from the present day and seem disconnected from what is actually happening in our current clinical settings. And that both on the standpoint of individuals from marginalized communities, right, who feel like, well, we're still being harmed right now. And also from the standpoint of individuals who work within the system, not from marginalized communities, who feel like, well, I can't do anything about what happened then. So as we're wrestling with that tension and we're trying to figure out how to really be responsive in our current moment, I'm wondering if you have thoughts or reflections. I'm a training director, so I'm thinking about trainees, about how we frame anti-racist practice in a clinical setting in our current space, particularly for individuals who are not from marginalized backgrounds. I know this is a long comment / question. I'll just say I am so for us healing ourselves. There is so much, we need that. We need those spaces. And also, when we come into these clinical spaces, we're not here, and there aren't enough of us to do that healing of ourselves. So yes. How do we meet the current moment?
Good question. Multi-layers to that question. But I think what jumps out at me as clinicians, and I'm trained in New York, so New York City is a very psychoanalytically derived or oriented training environment. So everybody in New York is psychoanalytically inclined. And so it always marveled me as to folks who are in a discipline that is always looking at, internal modes of motivation or looking at the hidden meaning or the subconscious expressions of conscious motivations, that we would allow 130 years to pass by before we examine ourselves as a discipline. I think so. There's something to be said about our response as a discipline to the history of this discipline, right? That we are, to some degree, in defense mechanism mode, certainly denial, repression, and lots of other things, projection, that doesn't allow us to really examine what's going on. Now, the other thing I didn't include, but it could have included, is the harm psychiatry has done to women. It was once thought that insanity in women was a function of their uterus, and they were performing clitorectomies to treat that. I'm doing the research. I have the book in my bag, but the harm done to women in the name of psychiatry is tremendous. Even the father of American gynecology, Marion J. Sims, who was also to some degree, because of the belief of the relationship to the reproductive organs in women, insanity, he was kind of crossing over into psychiatry too, with his surgeries on these enslaved Black women. So we have a culture that has to be changed. And in this culture, one of the agreements we have with each other is that we don't talk about certain things. And it's always been my belief, although America is a very diverse country now, it wasn't always that way. Black folk and white folk really have issues. Like in a strange, distorted way, we are family, a dysfunctional family, but given the length of our relationship, we have family dynamics. And part of that dysfunctional dynamic is silence. That we've agreed not to have certain discussions. This is why an apology isn't really an apology. It's hollow. In my state, there was a refusal to apologize for slavery, but they agreed to express profound regret. That's their words. That's what they said. We will not apologize, but the best we can do is profound regret, right? So you can't really, as clinicians, you know, you can't really have a reconciliation if there's no acknowledgement of the harm, of the initial harm. And that's where we are. We won't even acknowledge the initial harm, so how can we have a discussion about the repercussions or consequences? Yes, you, then you. Mm-hmm.
And thank you for that education. It was profound indeed. My quick question is, over the course of the period that you presented, there were Black psychiatrists and psychologists who were trained in this Western psychiatry and psychology. And I wanted to know if you can speak to their contributions and the way forward given that history for them.
Well, yes. One of the person who informed me about the vote was Alvin Poussin, a very famous Black psychiatrist. The other famous Black psychiatrists are Cobbs and Greer. They wrote the book Black Rage. Now, as you can see, and again, we all are plugged into this motherboard of white domination, in which we also echo the notions and ideas of how this works. So Cobbs and Greer wrote a book called Black Rage, explaining that Black people, all Black people, as a consequence of centuries of oppression, were sitting on this rage that could explode at any minute. In New York, where I'm from, there was a gentleman named Colin Ferguson. He was called the Long Island Railroad shooter. He was a Jamaican immigrant. He got on the train and started shooting white people. His attorney was William Kunstler, Bill Kunstler, famous civil rights attorney. He was going to use the Black Rage defense. And some Black folks who were thinking said, no, don't do that. Because you begin to pathologize, with a broad brush, normal reactions that people might have toward their maltreatment. So there are psychiatrists and psychologists that I came up under who were trained in these institutions, but in 1968, the APA had a meeting in San Francisco, and the Black psychologists amongst them had made demands on the APA to change their ways. The APA refused, and the Association of Black Psychologists was born from that. So from that, not only do we have our own organization, we had our own journal, for which I was the editor-in-chief, the Journal of Black Psychology. So we understood that sometimes you have to do for self. And that's been the way forward, that you can't rely on others to tell your story, because if you do, you'll always be in alerts. Sometimes you have to tell your own story. And so it's always a process, because you can never completely disengage from that motherboard of pathology, but you can at least make efforts to kind of rewrite and reconfigure what we understand about human behavior in the context of culture. Yes.
Yes, sir. Phenomenal presentation. The thing that's pointing out to me, right, is especially considering what you're saying, what the Black psychologists were saying in the film, is we have to heal ourselves. How does that healing look like? Now, when we have this conversation about healing modalities, in my opinion, I think that we got to look at ourselves culturally, specifically when you look at African cosmology, because a lot of the references has to do with Africa. And what's not being talked about in this conversation is what were the Africans doing before colonialism? What was working for Africans pre-colonialism? And considering the damage that has been done and the cultural impact from colonialism, from slavery and things of that nature, there has things that has been morphed, so to speak, especially in this space, because of the damage. Hip hop, for instance, coming out of that. other musical genres coming out of that as a result of that. So I'm saying these things just to, you know, put in context of the healing modalities that existed prior to colonialism and the things that we had to do in the event of the terrorism that we experienced here in the United States.
Good question. And my answer may seem strange at first, but bear with me. Again, like I said, I was trained in New York, and I had the opportunity, well, we were required to pick a theoretical orientation at some point in our training. And I struggled with that. I'm thinking, what makes sense to me? And so I was a big fan of Albert Ellis. And Albert Ellis has this approach called RET, in which he says that our distress is a function of our distorted thinking. The way we think about the world is what upsets us and causes distress and pathology. And it occurs to me that how Black people, African descent people, see the world is really the source of our pathology and our response to the world. The world is certainly hostile, and there are challenges in terms of our environment, but how we relate to that world is also the source of other forms of pathology. An example I like to think, well, let me give you a quick definition that's important. When we're talking about these relationships, we're talking about power dynamics. This is really the source of all of our problems. Sexism, racism, homophobia, whatever, power is at the center of that. If we were all the same race, all the same gender, we would create new forms of differences to distinguish between ourselves and distribute resources. So I think that we first have to understand that, right? And so if I am convinced that somehow my contributions or my understanding of my place in that power dynamic is on the receiving end, I'm going to be subject to the whims of others. For example, I want to give the definition of power that a gentleman, Wade Noble, likes to give. He says, power is the ability to define your own reality. That makes sense to me, right? So when I ask you, what's this? You tell me what? And when I say, what's this? Now, we all know that somebody made that up, right? Somebody made this as a bottle of water up. This is an iPhone. 50 years ago, it wasn't an iPhone. We wouldn't know what it was. But someone said, iPhone, water, microphone. We are all adhering to the reality of others, of someone else. And that's where the real power comes in. Power is the ability to define your own reality and have others accept your reality as their own. If I can do that, I've got you. I don't need chains or anything, laws, nothing. If you think that my reality is yours, then you got problems. And that's where we are now, that Black folks, we don't have our own reality, right? I have to dress a certain way, speak a certain way to make other folks comfortable with my presence so I can navigate white spaces, right? Now, because I do that consciously, it's a decision I make. I could choose not to. But some of us will lose sight of those decisions and it becomes a habit. And those are problems that we have now. We are relating to the reality of other people, not our own reality, right? So in the world of Albert Ellis, we need to shift our thinking. We need to dispute the irrational need to relate to the power or the reality of other people and relate to our own reality, and that's how we take power back. Real quick example, many of you may be old enough to remember when Black people were called Black, but before that it was Negro, right? Before that it was colored, right? Now it's African American. How did that happen? Black folks said, I think it might have been Jesse Jackson, we want to be African American. That's who we are. And after some time, that's become the reality. Many folks who are not African American understand it's offensive to refer to a Black person as something else. That's how we were able to define that reality and have others accept it as their own. We can do that with other things, right? Even now, the Crown Act, you can there was a time where you could lose your job for wearing cornrows, dreads, other kind of ethnic haircuts. But now there's a law saying it's illegal to discriminate against people who wear ethnic haircuts. That's an example of how defining your own reality and demanding that others accept it as their own works. We can do that with other things if we have the mind to do that. right? With our names, right? I once heard a student say, when I told them about the study that found that black people with black sounding names who sent out resumes got fewer callbacks than black folks, same resume, with white sounding names, their response was, well, don't name your kids any black names, right? That's the path of least resistance. If we all said, no, we're going to name our children black names, at some point, that becomes a norm. We've defined that reality, as opposed to letting others tell us what we should name our children and what we shouldn't name them. So it's about how we structure the world cognitively, right? So liberation begins here, and then everything else follows. I'm sorry I got on the soapbox there for me. Let me get back down off that soapbox.
We have a couple of questions.
Yeah, we got
from
a couple more questions. Oh, from the Zoom.
Yes. So someone's asking, where can we find the documentary?
If they stay in touch, I'll have a streaming site available this month.
Okay. Next question is, final question. She says, thank you for this very provocative talk. What resources can training programs in psychology and psychiatry and other healthcare areas use to begin to incorporate non-Western, non-Eurocentric ideas about mental health and illness to change the framework?
Wow, that's a heavy question. We have to begin having conversations. We have to have these conversations. We have to make demands on our programs. We know there's so many demands on students already that we don't want to have additional demands, but we have to ask and question and interrogate what we do know and what we do learn.
Any other questions? Well,
thank you.
I want to thank
Zoom.
you.
Okay.
Let us thank you for coming here. Please, those of us that are left, please join me in giving him a round of applause.
And to the folks on Zoom, thank you.
And there will be a recording for those that have asked. I've gotten lots of questions, so we'll have that up soon. Thank you.
Thank you again.